A small child sat on his father's lap in rapt attention, eagerly listening to his favorite story. Long ago, the world was embroiled in conflict. The bloodline of darkness ran rampant throughout the land, causing untold famine and anguish. The light of the world, upon seeing the people's strife, created 9 legendary heroes to fight back the darkness and restore order. Each one blessed with a weapon crafted by the gods, and a rune to prove their skill. They fought back the darkness and brought peace to the land. It was a story the child had heard many times over, but the father was nonetheless theatrical because of it. But, when the flames of conflict stirred anew, it's rumored the darkness will one day return. The chosen heroes will reunite and battle it once more! He shouted dramatically, throwing his hands up in the air in an attempt to startle the young boy. Though he merely looked on all the more eagerly, eyes filled with wonder. "Do you think I can be a hero just like them, Father?" the child asked meekly, almost embarrassed from how silly the question sounded. The father looked at him confused. "Well, the 9 heroes weren't just anyone, you know. Plus, you'd need a special weapon and a rune." "Yeah, I suppose you're right," the child replied, hanging his head sullenly and sinking into his bed. "Oh, don't look too disappointed," the father said, noticing the boy's discouragement and hoping to curb it. "It might not be impossible. Who knows?" As he closed the door, though he did not notice it himself, the child clutched his fist as tight as the little boy could, breathlessly whispering, one day for sure." Chapter 1. Gilbert stuck to his party as they all carefully traversed the cavern floor. The ground was uneven and filled with large fissures, stalactites jutting out of them like spikes. One wrong step, and he would be sent tumbling to his doom. Still, Gilbert didn't feel afraid. He was with the Golden Lancers battalion, the most feared battle group in the whole of the Avonian Empire. With seasoned party members like them at his side, why, there was nothing he could possibly fear. As they continued traveling, the cave they were traversing gradually grew narrower, and the rough geology gave way to cobbled stone as a pair of 2 gigantic wooden doors revealed themselves, standing imposingly as they towered over the whole party. "Looks like the general's information was on point. There really is a dungeon down there." Marcus, a practiced old hand within the party, gave a surprised expression, just barely penetrating his old but focused-looking face. "These wooden doors are covered in mud and look pretty beat up. The hinges are rusted, but I can still make out the metalwork," Gilbert said as he scanned over the door with the practiced eye of an antiquarian. "Since the casting is crude and the studs are copper, it's certainly not from our time. If I had to say, it might just be from before the first founding." Everyone within the party just stared at Gilbert like he was from another planet, stunned into silence from the fact that he was able to discern that much from the mere presence of a door. At the back of the group, however, a deep, hearty laugh could be heard. "See? I told you he wasn't a poor pick. The boy's earning his keep already." The voice seemed to call out in a jovial tone as a burly-looking man bustled his way up to the front of the group. Gilbert could tell in an instant from the voice, but the telltale clang of his armor and the dull red glow of his spear made it unmistakable. That man was the leader of the battalion, a reincarnation of one of the 9 legendary heroes, Hector, the Divine Spear. A newly minted member of the battalion, Gilbert had grown familiar with the sight of him, but seeing him up close once again, he could not help but be overtaken by the sheer majesty of the man. He was a frighteningly impressive warrior. Wrapped in the finest armaments given to him by the king himself, his whole appearance screamed regality. Carried in his arms, he wielded the divine spear, Svetavatra, a fabled weapon passed down the royal family for generations. It's said to only awaken in the hands of a true wielder. Much more subtle, but even more significant to Gilbert, was the dull red glow emanating from Hector's gauntlet. a faint sign of the man's legendary significance. He bore the crest of the Lancer, unmistakable proof of his divine heritage and destined purpose. Gilbert had always been taken by the myths and legends of old since childhood. He had grown up eagerly reading tales of heroism, of fabled knights and the exploits of conqueror kings. No tale, however, did he hold closer to his heart than that of the 9 chosen heroes. It had been a long time since their first war against the darkness. It must have been over 1,000 years ago now. But the darkness had returned. Massive armies of corpses and monsters were said to be waging war on the Empire's eastern borders. When Gilbert had heard the 9 heroes had been reincarnated to fight the threat once more, well, he couldn't help but volunteer for the army and fight for them. Never in his wildest dreams, however, did he think he would be selected to fight directly with them, though. It was practically a dream come true for Gilbert, and he couldn't help but feel a bit overwhelmed. As Hector stood in front of everyone, he tussled Gilbert's helmet and then began to pry open the door. The whole battalion eventually joined him in on the effort, and after a bit of struggle, the entrance was open, inviting the group into a hallway of snuffed-out torches and cobbled floors. "Gilbert, was it?" Hector said to him before entering the place. "Since you're new here, I want you up front with me. There could be any number of monsters lurking down here, and I want you to get a good taste of the action." Emboldened by the amount of trust Hector was placing in him, Gilbert marched forward to the head of the group firmly, right beside Hector. I'll try my best not to let you down, sir," Gilbert sincerely told him. The march into the dungeon was a slow one, and proved to be more and more arduous the deeper they progressed. What began as a simple stone hallway filled with mundane storage rooms of long ransacked goods developed into a series of forking paths and twisting stairways that led ever deeper into a genuine labyrinth of catacombs. All the while, paths they were treading grew ever more ancient and antediluvian. It was a maddening task just keeping track of their progress. But the constant harassment from the dungeon's inhabitants grew ever more persistent and deadly with each step they took. There were the usual pests and hostile wildlife that any enterprising explorer had to deal with. But there was also far, far worse. You see, that's the thing about dungeons like this. They were usually unlooted for a reason, and the fact that they were relatively intact just meant whatever protective measures were put up by the former occupants had proven to be so sturdy that they lasted well past their deaths. All throughout the dungeon, Gilbert and the whole battalion were beset by magical constructs, both organic and inorganic. Inhuman guards kept alive by magical power that seemed to ambush them wherever they went. Gilbert was in over his head, but the strength and coordination of the battalion kept him steady. Hector really was something. His confident laugh a bulwark which all the troops rallied under. It was only natural for a hero, but the strength he displayed was almost inhuman. Shrugging off blows that would kill a normal man, he wielded his spear with strength and ferocity, skewering monsters time and time again, impaling them clean through, setting them ablaze through the magical fire he wielded and channeled from the tip of his spear. Apparently, it was a special ability of the weapon he was paired with, a power that would only arise when the weapon was in the hands of its true wielder. Apparently, it was a special ability of the weapon he was paired with, a power that would only arise when the weapon was in the hands of its true wielder. To Gilbert, though, it seemed like he had control of the very elements of the earth. Throughout all of this, Gilbert was just desperately trying to pull his weight and not get too banged up that he couldn't keep going, hiding behind his shield and occasionally stabbing when the opportunity presented itself. And so, they slowly and painfully made their way throughout the dungeon, making a note of the location of any valuable materials, for them to be extracted later by the larger army once the dungeon was free of danger. They moved tunnel by tunnel, room by room, descending until they reached a massive opening in the walls. From a single doorway, they gazed out into a yawning black abyss of empty space. With Hector's fire illuminating the immediate area, they realized they were staring into an utterly massive cylindrical room. A small, spiraling staircase around the edge, leading ever deeper into unknown depths. The stonework was surprisingly smooth, as if the entire room was excavated rather than built. And all throughout the walls, the place was lined with statues, ancient-looking warriors of times gone by. "The general never told us this," a battalion member uttered in awe. "Clearly these catacombs are much larger than we initially imagined." Marcus, the oldest and most experienced of the battalion, immediately took stock of the situation. "We should call off any further ingresses and report back." "I'm not leaving here empty-handed. We've reached the most exciting part yet. Why turn back now?" Hector interrupted Marcus with a spirited and firm plea from the group. "If the hero wills it," Marcus responded hesitantly and with not a small amount of grief. But nevertheless, the battalion pushed forward. It all fell apart when we were about halfway down the staircase. The regular clattering of armor and thumping of boots was interrupted by a strange friction on stone that seemed to resonate throughout the room. The whole battalion stopped in apprehension as they listened to this almost rumbling that seemed to be anywhere and everywhere. And then, one after the other, tiny pinpricks of light started to appear in the room, piercing the pitch-black darkness, and they formed a gradual rough spiral as the rumbling sound got louder and louder. By this point, the battalion was spooked, and Hector lashed down his flame in all directions, desperately trying to see what was going on. For a brief moment, their immediate surroundings were illuminated, and Gilbert saw that the light was actually coming from the stone eyes of the statues. He looked deeply at those eyes, and, to his horror, the statue's eyes looked back. In an instant, stone began to move as if it was flesh, and the warrior statues that had seemed so decorative just a moment ago became an army of animated guards. Crawling out of their nooks in the walls with weapons pointed, innumerable behemoths had surrounded the battalion and were closing in fast. Gilbert gave an uneasy look to Hector, but he wasn't fazed. Unleashing all his power, he raised his spear, and in a triumphant cacophony of flame, poured down a rich inferno on the enemies in front of him. But there was little effect. Flame can burn flesh, but it can't do anything against stone. "Damn golems," Hector muttered under his breath angrily, and seeing there was no easy way out, a genuine look of fear was on his face, one that was shared by most of the men. "Charge!" Hector yelled almost desperately, as the whole battalion pushed forward up the staircase with as much strength as they could muster. What followed was an absolute free-for-all, a chaotic melee that saw a desperate, disorganized push up the stairway. It was every man for himself as each one blunted their spears against sturdy stone. The cracking of statues and the screams of men rang out as the battalion was cut down, one by one. There were only a handful of men who made it up with Hector to the top of the stairs when he reached it. And Gilbert was not among them. "We're alive, but we've still got men trapped there, hero," Marcus, another survivor who'd made it to the top, told Hector, who was currently biting his thumb in frustration. Those battalion members who were left behind were slowly being killed off, one by one, as, unable to penetrate the thick wall of stone in front of them, they were eventually surrounded and disposed of. Meanwhile, the brunt of the stone soldiers were slowly but steadily marching up the staircase to meet the survivors. In more ways than one, time was running out to make a decision. All the men waited on Hector's next orders with bated breath, their fearless leader the pillar on which they rallied behind. Gilbert, too, trapped though he was, knew he wasn't alone. Just like in all those tales he read as a kid, the hero would come to the rescue. But the once confident Hector's face had turned pale, and, finally presented with the threat of genuine danger to himself, his regal armor looked suddenly unfit on a man quaking in his boots. He stood in place for a few agonizingly long seconds, before a sudden tightening of his fists announced his decision. "Bar the door and bury the entrance," he mumbled in a shallow but firm voice. His men stood aghast for a moment at the implications of that demand. Murmurs of unease were spoken among them as the troops stationed at the top of the stairs struggled to push back the stone constructs. My hero, we would be dooming the rest of the battalion, Marcus, voicing the thoughts of the entire battalion, spoke. But Hector did not relent. We're all going to die if we don't seal up these monsters when we have the chance, he shouted in a frightfully forceful and commanding tone, and the entire group was stirred into action. Gilbert watched in horror as his former teammates buried his only exit in rubble. His savior, abandoning him, he gave one last look towards the man he had put his trust in, a forlorn and desperate plea to that inspiring figure whom he idolized. For just a fraction of a second, Hector's eyes did indeed meet Gilbert's, but he looked away and shut the door. In that now pitch-black stairway, Gilbert was forced to bear witness to the lives of his battalion members getting snuffed out one by one. Cut up in isolated pockets, their dying grunts the only sign of their inevitable end. When the chorus of agony grew silent, and Gilbert was slowly forced back to the edge of the stairway, he could tell he was the only one left. Stone weapons pointed in front of him, Gilbert felt the weight of the cliff-like drop behind him, his heels now dangling off the ledge. In an instant, a statue gave Gilbert a strike to the gut. Reflexively, he blocked it with his shield, but the weight of the blow pushed him backwards, and he was sent tumbling into infinite darkness. As he took the dive to what in all likelihood was going to be a fall to his death, Gilbert thought back to Hector, and how he had left him to die. With clenched teeth he muttered, "You're not a hero. You're not a hero at all."